talking with John Burris again, and John, without any further stuff, what do you think about the verdict?
I was not surprised at the not guilty verdict. Disappointed because I thought there was sufficient evidence to justify at least a manslaughter verdict. But the presentation of the case was such that it didn't give the jurors a lot of different options. The prosecution did not present, in my view, a strong case either for second-degree murder and or voluntary manslaughter. The evidence was there, but for whatever reason, they didn't pull it all together. And the defense was strong. They had a narrative that they wanted to promote, a self-defense narrative. But the prosecution never had a narrative as to why he was guilty either of first degree or second degree and or manslaughter. They essentially tried the case based upon the fact that George Zimmerman had made inconsistent statements. But it was never enough to say what he actually did and why he did it and why he is in fact guilty of a crime. So it was very disappointing in terms of the presentation. The other thing is, this case really may have been lost at jury selection because the jury had no African Americans on it.
Right.
This was important because profiling, racial profiling, is something that the African American community understands. Many in the white community, particularly ordinary everyday people, have no experience with this.
Right.
And this is a concept that African Americans live with every day, but the white community does not. And there was no one to explain the significance of profiling. And more importantly,
the judge get away with taking racial profiling off the table?
The judge got away with taking it out.
How did the prosecution let them do that?
Well, I think the prosecution did, but they didn't appreciate that the defendants were going to play racial. And they played race from the time that the case started by promoting George Zimmerman's view of suspiciousness, his view of acting in a way that someone reasonably might think he was suspicious. They had his hoodie on when he was in the store. They had an old picture of him where he didn't have a t-shirt on. And they played it in a way that was very direct, that if you have this fear of young African American men, and because there had been other robberies, this was a guy that you could identify with. And so the women on the jury, in my view, could identify with the fact that he may very well have been another criminal in the neighborhood, even though he wasn't doing anything. The defense did that. The prosecution really didn't counter that, and they didn't make a strong enough argument about where some of the real inconsistencies about where the gun was located, where the fighting took place, where the injuries took place. And so the jury really was left with this notion that there had been a fight, that George Zimmerman had been injured, there were cuts and lacerations on the back of his head and on his nose, and he could have feared that his life was in danger, as opposed to saying that those injuries did not occur after they occurred on the sidewalk. The fight ended up on the grass. On the grass, he was not getting his head knocked in. Right. And number two, his claim that Trayvon saw his weapon, that could not have happened given the way he was straddled. And number three, the injuries that he had were really relatively slight, and not the kind of injuries that one would say you were a reasonable person to believe that their life is in danger. So I thought that it was not promoted in ways, and prosecuted in ways that could do that. My feeling about it, frankly, is I don't believe the prosecution believed in their case. They didn't try this case in an aggressive manner. They were not strong on objections. They did not put forth the kind of aggressiveness that suggests that they really believed in the case. It may be they did not really have the evidence from their point of view to justify the accusations. That's why I thought that they overcharged the case, that they shouldn't have been charged as a second-degree murder case. It should really have been charged as a manslaughter. And by overcharging it and then trying a case around that, you then left yourself at a point of not putting forth strongly your best evidence. And so I thought they got hurt. Now, I will say this. This case, the verdict itself probably is within reasonable consistency of the evidence, given the instructions that were given. They were kind of confusing, and the jurors had a hard time with that. But the issues that are most significant to the African American community, and that was the issue of racial profiling. How is it that a 17-year-old kid can go to the store, buy Skittles and iced tea, and walking back home gets profiled by someone and winds up dead? And so the issue of profiling was a far bigger issue than the four corners of the case that was there. And that issue was not discussed, nor, more importantly, could it be really litigated in a trial itself. It's a discussion that every dad and every mom's worst nightmare is that they have a boy, a teenage boy, goes to the store and comes back, tries to come back, and he's profiled by someone and he winds up dead. That is an issue that should be discussed publicly. I know I have discussed it with my own son, my grandsons. I've encouraged my own son to have discussion with his sons, and anyone I know, that kids have to be able to know that if you're an African American male in your mid-teens, or late teens, or early 20s, you can be profiled by some unsuspecting person who's carrying a gun, and who could then believe that you are a suspect even though you're minding your own business. And so these were challenging issues, and I think that's why the pain the African American community is experiencing.
I got to ask you, because when something like that has happened to me, I remember I was at a Cal game a few years ago, and a guy tried to say I was taking his seat. I turned it around and I said, I called the police and said, this man's taking my seat, and they made him leave.
Okay.
Why don't we teach more of our kids to be proactive and use the legal system to our benefit, rather than assume that the person has all the power?
I do agree, though, that we do have to have conversations with our kids, particularly young men, on how to de-escalate a situation.
Yeah.
It's easy to confront. You know you're doing the right thing. You know you haven't done anything wrong, and someone accuses you. You immediately become defensive and basically blow the person off. That person then becomes very aggressive. And in Trayvon Martin's case, if George Zimmerman had just said, I am the neighborhood watch commander, I haven't seen you here before, where do you live, or something to that effect, Trayvon could have said, I'm here visiting my dad at the Fion's house. If that level of conversation had taken place by either one of them, this never would have happened. And so that's the question of what duty do you have as a kid, as a young man, and what do you have when you can be profiled and stereotyped, to sort of understand that can happen to you, and then communicate to the others in such a way to let them know that you really know, one, you know you have rights, and number two, you have not done anything wrong. That level of conversation and level of understanding is something that should transfer to the police as well, because what happened in this case was a quasi-police officer. This was a guy who wanted to be a police officer, who was engaging in quasi-police activities in many ways, and so you have to deal with him in terms of de-escalating the situation the same way you would deal with a police officer, because these people have guns. This man had a gun. You didn't know he had a gun, but people in Florida carry guns, and there'll be guns carried in other states. So there are lessons to be learned from this case.
Now, Don West made comments toward the prosecution that universally had been thought of as unkind. What did you think about what he said?
Well, number one, I can understand his being very upset with the prosecution. Prosecutors often will withhold evidence. They will make you do more work than you have to engage in. And that happened in this case. So there was really hard feelings. But when the case is over, one should be professional about it and not carry forward that kind of torch. So I thought that his comments were very much unprofessional and unbecoming for a person who had just won and who had done a tremendous job in doing the victory. He did not have to rub salt in the wounds of the prosecutors from a professional point of view. But I got it. They were very, very upset about the prosecutors' conduct. In fact, there are sanction motions that are still pending. The defense says we're going to go forward with those sanctions. That can happen in a case because, I was a little surprised when I heard that the prosecutors had not turned over certain evidence. And it turns out that a prosecutor left the office and told the defense that the prosecutors were withholding evidence. That really suggests that the prosecutors were very worried about their case and were trying to keep them from getting certain type of evidence, which is a flat-out no-no and is against professional ethics, and they could be sanctioned.
What evidence about?
I don't know what that evidence was.
Somebody was speculating that it was marijuana.
I don't know precisely what it was.
That doesn't justify being shot or getting shot.
No, that wasn't it.
Okay.
It's a question of building up your case. There may be other documents that they were there that they were supposed to turn over. I don't know what those were. There might have been prior bad acts, any number of things that they could have had that they thought they needed in order to properly evaluate the case. None of it justified the killing of Trayvon.
Yeah.
None of it.
Kind of conveniently have an ambulance going by. What about Mark O'Mara saying that this? Here's where I'm confused. They said it wasn't an issue of race. And yet it was. I'm not confused by that because institutional racism. But isn't there a danger in the winning prosecutorial or legal team, in this case defense team, going out and being a little cavalier in their comments as these gentlemen have been thus far?
Not really. I mean, these individuals are lawyers, defense lawyers. They just go on to the next case. Their reputation will be enhanced by what they did in this case. These little comments are not anything that people should be worried about. If anything, you want to know how come the prosecution didn't present a case that was winnable.
Did they throw the case?
I will
think
say
you made
this.
the comment.
I have to tell you, I felt that they were doing this because politically they had been pushed into the position, and they never really prepared this case in a way that was designed to win. And I come to that.
That's why the governor put Miss Corey in charge.
Right. They put it. Well, that first DA was not doing it.
Why?
Because they had concluded that there was no case. And so the first DA concluded that, the police department concluded that, and so the prosecution then the new prosecutor comes in, okay, we'll do the case. Now, they very well may have concluded as well that there was no case, and therefore they were then stuck in this case. And I don't know that, I hate to say they threw the case. I don't think they presented a case that was winnable, and certainly overcharged the case by second-degree murder. And I know that people would say that there was a basis for, and there was somewhat of a basis, and that is because of the ill will, the comments that George Zimmerman made about, quote, they always get away with calling them a-hole and punks and stuff. That's certainly evident a state of mind. But there wasn't any connection between what actually happened.
You know what bothered me, because this is consistently presented as positive for George Zimmerman. I thought it was a negative. They said he mentored black kids, and I felt, well, maybe that he thinks that black kids need to be fixed, like there's something wrong. I mean, I never thought that was a plus.
I don't know that I would. Yeah, well, it is a plus in how it's perceived, right? As to whether it's an actual plus, I think. Here's what that did.
It's more like, all these poor black kids, I have to help them, as opposed to, do you have a black person?
Here's what I thought. George Zimmerman was perceived by the prosecution as this mastermind thinker that had gone to school, taken defense courses, legal courses, and he always knew what self-defense was, and he tailored all of his statements around it. And so that was a narrative that the prosecution had. But then when you hear that he was kind of a softie, that people liked him, even the black professor had a very nice way of speaking to him as if he respected him, and then you had other people came in and say what a nice man he was. Well, and then you throw this on top of it, it undercut the prosecution's narrative that this was this highly sophisticated master criminal mind, and that was important to offset the negative thing that was said at the outset when they talked about the negative comments that he was making toward Trayvon Martin, because there's no question Trayvon Martin was profiled, and no question he perceived him to be a suspect and made all the statements that suggested he was a suspect when actually everything he was doing was relatively innocent. So I think that's why that went through. As to whether it's a plus or minus, it was used as a plus in the case.
Now, what do you think, if you were the person that was the prosecution, how would you have handled the case? If someone had called you instead of...
Well, I'm a former prosecutor as well, and I would have not charged this case, if it was up to me, as a second-degree murder case. I would not have done that. Even though there were some issues there, I I think the more significant case was around manslaughter, and I think I'd have been more aggressive in examining the contradictions that were made by George Zimmerman. The truth of the matter, George Zimmerman didn't testify. It may have been a smarter move not to put in all of his statements and put in the fact that the person was killed, that he's the person that did it, and he was present at the time, his gun was used, and force him to come testify. That might have been a better move, because once he got in all of his statements from the various sources, even though some of them were in fact inconsistent with each other or contradictory, at the end of the day, he didn't have to testify.
How did you think the judge, how do you assess how the judge handled the case?
I thought the judge was a competent judge. She was fair-minded. She gave everybody an opportunity to present their case. She probably let in some evidence I probably didn't think should come in, but I didn't have a sense that she was not.
Tell people how to contact you if they need legal help.
Well, if you have legal help, you can contact me at my office, 510-839-5200.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you.